Hi there, this is Sam and Shona from the Village Storytelling Centre in Glasgow. We're here to answer some questions today that Fest have sent us about working with migrants, newcomers and refugees. But before we break into the questions, we thought we'd just tell you a little bit about ourselves and the organisation that we work for. So Shona, do you want to tell us about some of the work that you've done in this area?
So I have been working with a company called Theatre Centre who uses theatre, storytelling and ethnographic research together, exploring life at the frontiers of Europe's frontiers. And so for that project, for this long extended project, we lived on an island of Lampedusa for a couple of months, which is the southernmost point of Europe. It's called the Porta d'Europa, or the doorway to Europe, some people call it that. And it's where a lot of the migrants travelling across the Mediterranean aim for. So we lived there to see what life was like for people who live and pass through the frontier. We also worked in Tunis, where a lot of the people set off from on that journey across the Mediterranean. And we also worked in Saint-Denis, which is a big community outside Glasgow, it's where we are now, outside Paris, where a lot of people end up settling, and often without legal documentation. I should also say that before that, I was a migrant. I lived in South America, working with communities to help teach them English through storytelling. So I think we need to understand that migration is part of a lot of people's stories.
Great. And before I worked for the Village, I wrote a verbatim play based on interviews that I did with gay men who were seeking asylum in the UK, and did about 9 interviews, which I edited into a play text. And then following on from that, I did a community project alongside 22 LGBT people who were seeking asylum in London. And that was a really fascinating and very contrasting project, which I'll probably talk a bit more about later on. So we've both been working for the Village Storytelling Centre. I've been here about a year, and
I've been here 5 months.
Yeah, and the Village has a long history of working with migrants and asylum seekers and refugees. The organisation's been going about 20 years. We're based in an area called Pollock in southwest Glasgow. And just about the time the organisation was being set up, there was a large influx of people who were seeking asylum, because the government changed its policies around where it was housing people, and it started a policy of dispersal, which meant sending people who were seeking asylum out into different communities around the UK, often communities that weren't particularly economically flourishing, so people being placed into neighbourhoods where there was a lot of tensions, a lot of social problems already, and there was a real issue around how people were integrating and with the local population. And the Village was really sort of key in trying to sort of aid and support people in that process. And from that, we kind of produced some of these books early on in our years. This one's called Buffalo Horns, which is published from some of the stories that people told from the cultures and countries that they'd come from, alongside some of their own personal stories. More recently, we've continued to work with migrants and asylum seekers. We've recently done a few projects with Hamik Greif. Do you want to tell us a bit about those?
I think as well, it's important to say, maybe I'm biased, but Glasgow has got a very open attitude these days. I think it's really known for that. But so the work I've been doing with Hamik Greif has been with BMEs, Black and Ethnic Minority Women, who were brought to the UK via forced marriage, and they are all having their asylum status processed or have received it recently, which is quite great. In this project, I worked as a storyteller alongside a seamstress, a sewer, and together we would come together every week and we would sew and we would chat, and the stories would flow between us. Sometimes I would bring a traditional Scottish story and they would use that as inspiration from which to create the sewing piece. And by the end, we had these incredible pieces, small pieces, which each came from a word that they thought was important. And as a whole, it read this big tapestry. It was like a chorus of expression. It's a really powerful project.
So how can storytelling be used with migrants, newcomers and refugees? I think there's lots of different ways. A few that I just sort of thought of highlighting were kind of just a basic diversionary activity. It's just very important to bring joy and laughter and fun into communities, and storytelling is a brilliant and very flexible way of doing that. Educational, it's a way to share cultures, to meet with people, and hear about the places that they're from, and also developing literacy. You've done some work around that recently as well, haven't you? Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, so I use storytelling often with very reduced words, and I use a lot of miming to help communicate a narrative so that we can engage in a very unpatronising way with people who don't have English as a first language. I find that work really fascinating, and I think sometimes we get a bit obsessed with the idea of stories meaning words and talk, and actually it's the whole expression of our bodies to other bodies who are listening. Mm-hmm.
And then there's the therapeutic elements of storytelling. And at Village we always say we use therapy with a small t. Mm-hmm. We're not trained as therapists, and we wouldn't advise anyone to try and attempt to do that unless they have formal training in that. But storytelling has a naturally therapeutic element to it, just in terms of being able to look back and celebrate the past, to develop self-reflection, to think about futures and what kind of future, and imagine those and rehearse those. And that's a really essential part of storytelling. And obviously the final one is story gathering, and that can be obviously the big one. Migrants often have incredible, extraordinary stories that people want to hear. These are the stories that fill up newspapers, that draw in audiences, but also there's the biggest dangers around that of being of the risk of placing people in dangerous situations mentally and being damaging and exploitative. So it's one of the ones where you have to be most careful, I suppose. Yeah. What can be some of the objectives and motives for using storytelling with migrants, newcomers, and refugees?
I think we hear stories about migrants all the time. Every time we turn on the television, we open a newspaper, we hear a politician. We are constantly discussing migrant narratives, and often those narratives aren't coming from the migrants themselves. So we can use storytelling as a tool to craft and decide what stories should be shared and what they want to share themselves, and then to platform them and share them and humanise what can often be seen as a big homogenous group of migrants, but actually it's individual human experiences with very diverse cultural differences.
How can this be accomplished in these sort of storytelling projects? I think first of all, the most important thing is having networks and a reputation. It's really important to get those things established, whether starting out through volunteering and just going out to meet people who are going to be able to help your projects happen. In terms of finances, this is obviously a very controversial and extremely marginalised group of people. There isn't an enormous amount of resources out there. Probably say to organisations is not to expect artists to work for free, but at the same time there is a recognition that the need is far greater than the resources. So this is an area where being personally funded to volunteer is perhaps a really essential key aspect to being able to do this work. We have these three stances that we talk about here. We have fiction, which obviously you're talking about sort of the world of the mythical, folklore, magical fairy tales, those sort of stories, and thinking about the meaning that they have for us and the way that they can celebrate and entertain us. We talk about one step removed, where you're working with groups to perhaps create a character or an alter ego who reflects them and their experience but isn't them. And that's very useful for getting people to talk about their experience without putting too much onus on them to personally disclose, kind of like people are able to regulate their level of engagement that they're able to have with that. And finally, there is the personal, which doesn't always have to be the deepest and darkest stuff. Personal stories obviously are great for just sharing anecdotes and humour and getting to know each other, but obviously there is the more intense focus that personal storytelling can have too. And I think the other really essential thing is just having the time and the space to come alongside people and find out who they are. I think that's something that I learned between doing my verbatim play and doing the community project. Is the verbatim play I came in, I wanted those stories, I did these interviews, whereas actually when I worked alongside the community kind of like for a longer period, I realised those weren't necessarily the stories that they wanted to tell. People wanted to talk about how they were nurses, they were business people, they were musicians, they were artists. They didn't want to be known as the worst things that ever happened to them. And so that was a real shift in my practice, was getting to spend that time with people.
That's really interesting.
Is this kind of work difficult? I don't want to say yes. It definitely requires that being prepared and having support around you. And is it frustrating? I think the things that I found it's frustrating, kind of like the chaoticness that people are forced into through their position. Often you're dealing with people who are dealing with very distressing things, who maybe haven't eaten that day, who can't come to the workshop or project you're running because they don't have money for transport. And so those are the frustrating things that come out of it.
Also, you might be working with people who have had a traumatic experience but have processed that, or living very happily, but still when they share their stories with you, it's still shocking for us, even if they're in a good place.
Yeah. Do you need any specific training to do this kind of work? Broadly speaking, no. This is a sort of self-regulating sector and self-regulating work, but I would say there are real ethical considerations to take into account. That you are going to be working with, as Shona says, people who are potentially traumatized, who are very vulnerable, and you have to have the readiness to deal with and support with the people that you're working with in a really rounded, personal-centered way. So there is a real ethical consideration to take. What is your readiness level? Are you ready? Are the people you're working with ready? Is your co-worker ready? And what training do you need to support that? And there are obviously great courses out there and around, and some people just do have a natural aptitude for this, but it really is about being self-reflective, I suppose. And what are the competencies a storyteller should possess?
What you were saying before, I think you've got to remove your ego. You can't be sensation-seeking, I think, and you've got to be able to listen. Yeah.
And be perceptive as well, kind of like what is going on in your group, kind of like, and who needs support, where are there tensions perhaps. It's being able to pick up on those things and be able to work with those effectively. Any pitfalls you should be aware of? I'd say you have a lot of power as a facilitator. Be very wary of that. Kind of, is this about your outcomes that you're seeking, or are you really coming alongside, as I keep saying, and letting the participants lead the program and where it's going? If you are going deep, is there good wraparound support from co-workers and organisations that you're working with to support people if things do come up? If you are taking stories, are you including the participants to the extent that they want to be included in how you're using them? That's the main ones I'd say. Could you add an example of a facilitator or mentor in action? Any sort of thoughts on that?
I think participant-led processes are always really interesting and powerful. So when the group themselves are setting the direction of the project, for me that's really good. I also think the way that we work at the village as individual storytellers but as part of a team is quite a good example of this. We peer mentor, and we're always sharing stories. So I think that's good too.
Great. I'm just going to jump on to the last question before we finish, which is, could you talk about the reaction of our participants? And I'd say that the LGBT community project that I worked on in London, we showed the piece at a conference which was done about LGBT migration, and a lot of the participants, they attended the whole day and they felt unfortunately quite sidelined, and they felt like they were talked about like they weren't there, and that was quite upsetting for them. So it was amazing when they had this hour or so just to say, like, this is who we are, this is us, this is, listen to us. People in the audience found that a hugely powerful experience, and one of the lawyers for one of the participants said they'd never seen their clients in this light before. And I think the word empowerment can get thrown around a lot, but what a woman said, this is a genuinely empowering experience, which I think is what you're wanting from these kind of projects. But I thought we'd just finish by reading one of the participants' stories that they shared. This is from a project that Shona recently worked on with Heimat Greif.
So this is Saida's story. I sing Incy Wincy Spider with my daughter, and I realised that sometimes I feel like that spider. I try to reach my goal and then I get pushed down, but when I get the chance again, I get back up and start to climb. I get exhausted, but then I get encouraged and I can go on. It's the love of my daughter, mother love, that keeps me going and gives me courage. I want my daughter to have choices in life and the chance to explore herself fully. I want her to speak. I will always listen. I want her to be protected. I want her to have freedom. I want her to have space. She should know that I am the mother. but I don't want her to be scared of me. I want to have a friendly relationship with her. I want us to play. I need space to play. I want her to be open to new things. I want to give her time. Sometimes I want to carry her school bag because it's my choice. Right now, she feels like her world moves around me, and I know my life moves around her. I don't know if I'm doing right or wrong, I just know what I want for her. It's the mother love that keeps me going and keeps me climbing back out to the sunshine.
So thanks very much for watching, and we really hope that you're inspired to go off and work on your own projects. Thank you very much.
Bye, thank you.